We're going to show you the unedited version of the Run With It podcast. If you'd like to see the condensed, edited, polished version, that probably won't exist completely because we're kind of crass and Alien's just been cursing like a sailor already.
We'll be edited.
Yeah, it's tough to rein her in. I don't know, Friday afternoon, I guess. No, if you'd like to hear the polished version, you'll be able to find that on your podcast player in about a week or two, with show notes and all that good stuff. So go subscribe to the Run With It podcast, and you'll get all that good stuff. And you can sign up for our newsletter and learn all this wisdom from Aileen and get all that in your inbox. So if you guys are ready here, we can get started with the recording.
I'm ready.
Let's fucking do it.
Let's do it.
There it is.
Let's make this an explicit
I told you,
episode
I
before
warned
we
you.
start, Aileen.
I warned the listeners.
Just trying to live up to expectations.
I know. We're just going to bring out your alter ego here. Okay. I'll just type in one last note here to make sure that I don't flub the idea itself like I did earlier. Okay. Let's do it. Welcome to Run With It, where we bring you business ideas from proven founders.
Wait a second. Back up from the microphone a little bit. That was
was that a little too hot?
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thank you for that. All right. Welcome to Run With It, where we bring you business ideas from proven founders. Each episode, you'll hear a new business idea and the exact steps our guests would take to get started. We're your hosts, Chris Justin.
And Ethan Janney. And on today's show, we have Aileen Lerner. She's the founder and CEO of Interviewing.io, an anonymous technical recruiting platform where companies like Facebook, Uber, Dropbox, and Snap have hired great software engineers. Aileen, cut me off, Chris.
I know, man. You're trying to cut me off from cutting you off. What's going on here?
Me off. I'm cutting you off. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
What were you going to
say?
I was going to say, Ethan, Aileen's got a super impressive background. We all know that. People can go find out more about that all over the internet. She's a prolific blogger, thought leader in the hiring and interviewing space. She's been on the Indie Hackers podcast twice. But this show is about, maybe more. I don't know. Who knows?
Twice. Well, we'll see if they have me back.
Well, this show, we're all about new business ideas. And no, Aileen, you are excited to share one with the listener. This idea is an analytics system, an add-on for applicant tracking systems. What was the experience that you had that triggered this concept in your mind?
Yeah, well, this is a very niche idea. So like, maybe I should say what an applicant tracking system is, like before I even get into the idea. So anytime you apply for a job, right, there's probably some application you have to fill out where you have to put your name and like link to your LinkedIn. And that's usually the front end of one of these systems. It's essentially a CRM, customer relationship management, specifically for hiring, that companies use to post jobs, to actually get applicants for those jobs, and also to track the candidate journey through the process. So you can see, how many candidates are currently applying, how many candidates have phone interviews, how many have offers, right? And you can potentially even do scheduling in these things, email with candidates. They're getting more and more featureful as time goes on. It's kind of like, it was always weird to me that recruiting had its own CRM when sales CRMs are so good, but there are things about recruiting, I suppose, that are a little bit unique. Examples of ATSs that you might have heard of, or maybe you didn't notice their brand when you were applying because you were annoyed that you had to apply online to something. But examples are Lever, Greenhouse, and JobVite was like one that was big in the early 2000s. They're kind of seeing a bit of decline now, but you've seen them before. So what triggered this idea? So as you know, I run a company called Interviewing.io. We're a hiring marketplace. And our whole shtick is that we think resumes are terrible. And instead, we offer people, this is just software engineers for now, we offer software engineers anonymous mock interviews, which is pretty useful. You can practice without having to set up throwaway interviews at companies where you don't want to work. And then if you do well in those interviews, no matter how you look on paper, no matter who you are, you can directly book real interviews at top companies, bypassing having to put in your name and all that other stuff that I talked about earlier. So the really sort of weird thing about our platform, and I'll explain why this matters in a moment, is that we have gotten a lot of companies, like the ones that were mentioned earlier, to trust us and to actually interview our candidates without ever seeing a resume and completely anonymously. And of course, engineering time is expensive, and it took us a lot of convincing to tell companies like Dropbox, hey, you should totally talk to randos on the internet without knowing who they are. We promise you they're smart, which is kind of our sales pitch. So
I want to cut in here real quick, because there's a bunch of stuff that's coming up for me that is interesting. And that's just like trends in everything, like trends in how technology and just new opportunities is affecting the way things work. And the truth is just a lot of weird stuff that happens because it used to happen. Like I was, I did my PhD, and I, for some reason, thought, when it was in biology, neuroscience, and for some reason I thought, well, this is going to be at the cutting edge of technology, everything that we're doing when I'm doing my PhD. And, I was really surprised that the system is still, you write a paper, it's primarily text driven. And, maybe if you went a little bit extra, there'd be some sort of video of the data or some sort of advanced interactive things to work with. But there's all these places where we're still doing this stuff where it's like, that's really antiquated, right? And it doesn't actually work. So it's something, I think, for the listener to notice, where are these headaches happening where people just keep doing things because that's what you're supposed to do, and that's the way it's supposed to be done. And on top of that, I don't know what you found, but I found, because I've also dealt with these things, it's incredibly difficult to change these things. Like something that people are continually already using, even if it doesn't work, they also are very resistant to the alternative. So
especially in enterprise, like if you're dealing with huge customers and consumer, it's like very easy to innovate, right? Because if something's easy and cool, people will just use it. But getting buyers to switch, right, on behalf of a company is a completely different animal. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that later. But yeah, I mean, where are our flying cars?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I was actually going to preempt. So that question that I asked you, I'm going to guess at an answer here, is that you are seeing that these companies are having a hard time valuing your candidates that you're presenting to them, comparing them to other channels that they're experiencing. So this problem and solution would be scratching your own itch if they can see, hey, an interviewing IO candidate is worth 100 times or 10 times worth of some rando applicant that you get into your system.
That's exactly right. And we've done a lot of digging. We have a lot of like industry benchmarks, and we've seen that our candidates tend to move through the funnel sort of 3x better, at least, than candidates from other sources. And we've written homegrown versions of this where we've actually exported ATS data from our larger customers and done this analysis for them. So like our burden of proof is always like, trust us, talk to these randos because they're going to be better. But it's hard to make that case when your customer isn't necessarily educated in like what the baseline is. And then it's harder to sell because you're the one thing that really differentiates you is not as powerful as you think. So that's
what companies currently. Yeah, how is Google or how is Facebook? How are they currently valuing these different streams of applicants?
Yeah, a little less familiar with their systems than some other companies, but I think both have in-house tools that they've written, right? And those
you can speak
tools,
to a company that you're more familiar with, if
so a lot of our customers tend to use existing ATSs, and ATSs like Lever and Greenhouse. Google, and Facebook wrote their own. These ATSs do have reporting, right? But that reporting isn't always reliable, and it's very brittle. So it works in some specific cases, or it works if your funnel is set up exactly the way that a standard funnel would be set up. And it also depends on you sort of doing certain things to update your data. So this data is not necessarily reliable, and it's also not well communicated throughout the org. So you might have to dig for it. If typically on a sales call, one of the discovery questions we always ask is, what portion of your candidates pass technical phone screens? And it's shocking how few organizations actually know the answer to that. And then eventually so you might say, well, maybe they just don't care and this is a dumb idea. But what we've seen is that there comes a day when somebody wants this information all of a sudden. And then the recruiting department is running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And then all of a sudden, like a VP of Eng wants this, or a new incoming VP of recruiting decide they want this information. And then they're like, okay, all right, we need to hire some consultants, or we need to bring in somebody from the Eng team. And of course, the Eng team doesn't want to give Eng time to this. And then they end up doing some expensive ass integration with Tableau or Looker. And I've talked to recruiters that have been like recruiting operations managers, that's their title, that have been tasked with figuring this out. And either they're banging their head against the wall trying to deal with a gross Excel export and clean it up, which is really hard, or they're just like, screw it, we're going to spend a lot of money. We need this now all of a sudden. So I think there is some validation that this is needed. It's not always needed when you expect, but when it's needed, it's really needed.
Sorry, you probably covered this, but repeat it back for me. Is so you said that at some point it just becomes needed. Why is that needed? Is it just, you said that a new VP event might want it, but is there an actual, like, unpack the reasoning behind why they want it?
So a few different reasons. One thing that happens often is companies sort of take for granted that there's a lot of engineering time that goes into hiring. And in fact, and in an average, like decent funnel, I guess, it takes about 90 engineering hours to make a hire as compared to maybe like 30 or 40 recruiting hours. So it's a lot. And that's fine for a while. And then all of a sudden you enter some kind of growth inflection point, right? Or all of a sudden your interviewers start burning out because they're tired of doing 4 interviews a week and constantly getting interrupted and not being able to do their real work, which is building product. And that just happens all of a sudden, right? And no one's prepared for it. And then you're like, shit. So one reason is the Eng debt that you're sort of accruing with making all your engineers do interviews bites you in the ass. Another one just could be a changing of the guard, where a new leader comes in. And one of the things you generally want to do when you're new is get a handle on how the organization works. And in recruiting, the funnel is the key to that, right? Because then you can tell where all your inefficiencies are, and you can tell maybe where you should allocate headcount, right? Do you need more sourcers? Do you need more, like, why are candidates dropping out? And you can't really, or another reason is when you're setting budgets for the next year, right? How much money what tools are working, what tools are not working for us, how do we know? And then, it's not a problem until all of a sudden it's a hair on fire problem. And it could be other reasons too.
So I noticed in our sort of pre-interview form that we put out to you, you called out some metrics that you might want to keep track of within your hiring funnel, broken out by source, right? Like, where did these people come from? Cost per hire, time to hire. I guess that's from like initial contact to the time that they actually join. Cost per hire and time to hire broken out by source and factoring in the Eng time, like you said. I just want to ask you a follow-up to this. Those all seem like great metrics. And I see a pattern in the type of work that you do. You're known for writing articles that are data driven, right? That it's not just your typical, what do you call it? Clickbait headlines and, faulty promises that people are making in articles online, top 10 lists, listicles, things like that. You're writing some really in-depth, thought-based, data-driven articles. Can you speak a little bit about how you've seen the power of paying attention to data be powerful for you and the people that you're serving?
Yeah. Well, just one of the more obvious ones is Eng time, right? So we touched on that a little bit already, but people don't realize how one weird trick, right? Speaking of clickbait headlines, but one small funnel optimization can actually make a huge difference in how much Eng time you spend per hire. So it's linear. So if you, for instance, double your pass-through rate from technical phone screen to on-site, you're actually going to cut the number of eng hours spent per hire by half. So it's like goes from 90 to 45, which is crazy because that's like $7,000 in eng time, maybe close to 10 grand that you're saving every time you make a hire. And if you're making a lot of hires, that adds up real quick. To me, that was kind of really eye-opening when I did the math. And what is especially shocking is how most engine recruiting leaders don't think about this stuff because they either don't have access to the numbers or they're just not in the headspace.
That reminds me of Cal Newport. We talked about him a fair bit on the show, but he's big influence on me through his books. He talks about how productivity is overrated. I'm going to paraphrase this, but you don't want to become more efficient at wasteful tasks. You want to change the entire workflow to become more efficient overall. And that's a much higher lever than just pure, getting things done, for example. There's a place for GTD, but as you said, if you can reduce that pass-through rate by 50%, then that's a much bigger difference.
There's a very concrete example of this that this doesn't come from me. It comes from a friend of mine who used to work at Open Door. He's an engineer and was very heavily involved in their interview process. He's actually writing about this now. I don't want to steal his thunder, but he's going to put a guest post on our blog about it. So I guess it's okay if I preempt him a little bit. So he actually dug into their funnel. And the reason and it took a while and it was a pain in the ass, but the reason that he did it is because he selfishly wanted to show that he was a better interviewer than some other guy, which
that's
is
a great reason.
Motivator, right? I think he just wanted to show that he was better at picking ponies, essentially, that his candidates would do better downstream. But that actually, often the best projects start out of spite. I'm sure interviewing I started out of spite and for a number of reasons as well that I won't get into. But
actually, I do kind of want to get into them. I'm sorry if you had to finish that point, but one of the things that I, in prepping for this call, I made a caricature of you in my mind, and you're a very pleasant person meeting you via the Zoom interview. But I was like, Aileen, she just loves to go on rants. She's like Peter Griffin, grind my gears. She's just, she could crush that segment. And if you read your Twitter posts and your tweets, your blog posts, I feel like maybe you're just tapping into this
rage,
repressed rage that everyone is feeling, maybe even particularly devs are feeling. So
well, I guess mine is pretty tame. I'm like, I hate how funnels are inefficient. Right, that's a very different thing than maybe some other sources. But you're right. I am a very angry person. I try to be pleasant about it when I can. So what happened with this guy, which was really cool, is when he dug in, he noticed that there were a handful of interviewers. So a typical funnel has a few stages. There's a phone screen stage. There's stuff that happens before the phone screen too. But at some point, if you're an engineer, you're going to do a phone interview with an engineer, right? And then if you do well in that phone interview, the next step is typically an on-siter these days, maybe a Zoom on-site. So what he saw was that there were certain interviewers that actually had the same pass-through rate as others in the technical phone screen, but the candidates that they picked ended up actually being twice as successful in the on-site. And that's really, really important because the on-site is further down the funnel and the on-site also takes 6 hours, right? So what they ended up doing after they
just let me clarify. So it was the people that were doing the phone screen were somehow better at choosing who would actually be a good candidate.
That's right. And why they were is a very fascinating question that I don't have an answer to. And maybe he does. We'll see. I read his latest draft. He might have some good thoughts about it in the next one. It's a hard question to answer. But putting that aside for the moment, right? That's the kind of digging, this is the kind of digging that I think if you had a data scientist available to you and you were looking at your recruiting funnel the way you were looking at a product funnel would just be par for the course, right? But it's not.
One thing that's standing out to me, it's a hypothesis at this point. I recently went through principles, Ray Dalio's principles. And it's an interesting book if you're thinking about data, if you're thinking about hiring. He talks a lot about personality profiles, putting people in spots that they're good at, getting rid of people that don't fit things, and also tracking all of this stuff with data, right? But what I'm finding interesting about this whole process, you're talking about eng time, right? And these people are focused on engineering, right? They're not HR people. And I can see that, if I were to hypothesize what's going on differently about those people that are picking the people, they're just better at picking people. That's their thing, right? Like maybe they're not as good at engineering, and they are engineers, and so I think that's an interesting little focal point to pick out, that, and just a general principle, that maybe the listener can even take away. Is like, different people are good at different things, and don't try to make them do things that they're not good at, and try to find people that are good at the thing you need done, instead of taking your existing folks and
I think
and having them do it.
One might say that's a controversial. I agree with you 100%. Some might say that's a controversial take, because there's been so much of a movement to standardize interviews and to sort of like move away from intuition and have all of these rubrics. I'm a big believer in intuition, but it's some people might disagree with you.
Malcolm Gladwell will disagree with you. His latest book is very much anti-intuition in that sense. He talks all about how that's talking to strangers. But I imagine
I just finished that actually.
Yeah? Did you have a different takeaway than what I just shared?
I think it's nuanced, and I think that's a whole other podcast. I'm gonna put a
okay, punt on that one.
Yeah,
that's fine.
I would add this though, at the risk of having so many people talking at the same time, cutting in here, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's intuition. It could be skill. It could be, and I haven't read the Malcolm Gladwell book, so I don't know exactly how he lays it out, but I would less liken it to intuition and more liken it to, ability, like innate ability, which wouldn't be either innate or learned ability. The intuition can be, I've got a gut feeling about this person, but another thing could be, literally Ray Dalio talks about these personality types, which there's some debate about their accuracy and things like that. But if you had someone who's doing the interview is like, okay, this is kind of the profile that you're fitting, and this would make sense, and then you're probably going to have flying colors as you pass the next thing. But they're not just saying, my gut tells me you're good. No, there's an actual analytical process that's going on that they have access to, that has nothing to do with saying, okay, how am I going to assign all these engineers to put this code together? It's a different skill set. Yeah.
That's a fair point. And I guess the more of these you do, potentially you get better and better, and you just become this finely tuned, well-calibrated machine.
I'm going to add one point here, because I think I can do it relatively quickly from that book, is people who are actually really skilled and practiced at doing those things, like judges or CIA operatives, performed just as badly at their main tasks as the lay people, is one of the findings that he had from the book. So it's there are a great number of people who fit within that typical category, but if you have a personality that is a little abnormal, then people are really bad at assessing those things. But again, that's completely aside. I don't want to get too far into it. Let's come back to the main idea here a little bit. So we're talking about an analytics tracking platform, an add-on for something like Greenhouse or Lever. And the question that comes to mind for me is, why don't they do it themselves? Yeah, why don't they do it themselves? Of course. And I'll add just a little bit to that is neither of them have anything to lose, from my perspective, by providing that data, right? It'd be one thing if Facebook had to provide it, and then or Indeed.com had to provide it, right? They might find that their platform sucks for vetting candidates, but these ATSs, they're neutral.
Yep. So I have a few guesses. This is something I, of course, anticipated this question and kind of racked my brain and discussed it with a few friends beforehand to see what they thought. I have a few guesses. So my best guess is, and some of this just comes from interacting directly with folks who build ATSs and getting some sense of how they prioritize their roadmap. Whenever stuff like this, like, it sounds easy, you just build a funnel, right? But it's actually not. And we took a stab at doing this internally, and though it didn't take us very long to do it per customer, there was still a fair amount of manual work. We needed to do a lot of tagging. So for instance, we were trying to figure out for this customer, what is your best source? And of course, we ended up being their best source, which was amazing. We didn't know going in that we were hoping, and that's why we invested the time, but we didn't know. So we had to find all their sources, put them in a spreadsheet, and then categorize them. Is this an agency? Is this a tool? Is this, what kind of, is this college students? Is this, so it took a fair amount of work. And I think building these weird custom one-off things is not the right way to spend time for a company of that size that is dealing with a ton of customers. I think if their biggest customer came to them and said, we're going to give you a shit ton of money to build this for us, then they will, right? But most companies are not big enough to warrant the distraction, right? And the way they store they're set in how they store their data. So like accessing it might be a pain in the ass. And like the bigger you are, the harder it is to actually be nimble and do this stuff. And it's probably not worth their time. And if you look at something like Salesforce, right? I mean, Salesforce is a CRM. Ultimately, in order to get your Salesforce instance to work the way that you want, you typically have to bring in a Salesforce consultant, and custom companies having these custom needs is what sort of drove Salesforce to become an app platform, which in turn turned them into this huge business, right? And that took like 20 years.
I can speak to that. I'm going through that with a client right now, and it's big money to consult on Salesforce installation. It's like, 30 grand up to 120 grand plus for some of the quotes that I've gotten for installations.
That sounds about right. And to sort of bring this full circle, ultimately, I think what Salesforce acquired Tableau, right? And I think they acquired them either for 15 or 50 billion, but like, 2-digit billion dollars. But why didn't Salesforce just build all this customization in from day one? Because it probably didn't make sense for them to do that. Now, one might say, well, is this a viable venture business, right? Because how does this scale? This sounds really niche. And what's to stop somebody from ripping you off? I actually don't know if it's a viable venture business, but I do think that for a small team, this could be an amazing lifestyle business. And then, of course, ultimately one of the ATSs could buy you, or you could become the Tableau of hiring. And there's a lot of opportunity there. But I would say the most likely scenario is you make 5 to 6 figures per one of these deals, and then you build some lightweight version for smaller companies, and then you're pulling in 7-8 figures a year, and it seems like a pretty good bet to me. I hope that answered the question. It was a little head-wavy,
it does. I mean, I think that it doesn't completely take away the risk, in my mind, at least, right? Like someone like Greenhouse or Lever still could come in and build this. Let's say you got to this business to an 8-figure business, and then they say, oh, we can do all that, and they turn it on.
But at that point, they might as well buy you also, right? Because they chose not to build it for so long because it's a pain in the ass, and they still know it's a pain in the ass.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Another thing that comes to mind for me, and this is more, I'm interested in your background a little bit here. The solution that you came up with for interviewing is so novel. I mean, it's brilliant, and it's clearly working super well. This idea that you brought to us just is so opposite. It's like, it's unsexy. Like it's just, I'm wondering, is there something in your experience that you felt like going through that innovation and uphill battle of trying to change people's minds, that if you were doing it again, you wouldn't do that? You would instead go after an idea like this?
Good question. Well, I think the reason I came up with this idea for this podcast rather than something like Interviewing IO is because Interviewing IO didn't originate fully formed from my head, like Athena springing. I don't know my mythology. Somebody will get that.
Close enough for me.
It took years of sort of beating my head against the wall and being frustrated with recruiters and being frustrated with hiring and just sort of trying to hack, like, how can I make people look at good candidates without looking at just candidates that went to MIT and Stanford. But it didn't happen all at once. So I think any idea that you originate is going to come from pain. And this idea came from a different set of pain points when I realized that I am not selling the way I want because our customers don't have a baseline to which to compare us successfully. Right. And this is what I want to sell, right? Is like, we have better candidates. That should be the differentiator. We don't want our differentiator to be something else that is maybe easier to sell, but isn't as exciting in terms of changing hiring. So I don't know if I were to go back. No, I don't know. I think that this is
what I'm hearing from that is that it's not necessarily that you are optimizing for unsexy idea or sexy idea or an innovative versus non-innovative idea. It's more figuring out what that pain is, that problem is, and you may end up this may end up turning into a super innovative way of handling the solution.
Yeah,
even though it has humble roots.
A really intriguing thing that I've found about starting projects, you can the fantasy, the story, the kind of like biblical representation of starting a business is that you have this insightful idea, and then because of your insightful idea, it becomes this amazing thing. And then there's another approach, right, where you have an idea and it kind of grows and changes, and then it becomes the thing that's insightful. What I found interesting about some of my processes starting businesses, like, people want this story, and even clients want the story of that, I had this insight one day and this is what it is. And even if that's not what happened, or I'm not saying this is what's going on.
This is why people like Malcolm Gladwell, right? Because it's like the universe is simple.
right. Yeah. It's important to recognize that there's a unique process of starting a business, and there's a unique process of telling the story of starting that business. And sometimes those things aren't actually the same. I'm not saying that this is what's going on with interviewing.io, but there's a piece of interviewing.io that is really exciting, saying, we wanted to make the hiring process more anonymous and give a fair and equal shake to everybody involved. But there's also another way where you could have just started the business. It worked well, and you found out that was appealing to people. And so you have to say that because that's what people care about, so it's
that's exactly. I mean,
interesting.
It's like what I hate sort of is how smart people or creative people are portrayed in film, right? You're trying to solve a problem and you're sitting in the park and you're all dejected, and then you see a napkin fly by, and the way the napkin curves reminds you of like something, and then you go and build a rocket, right? That's not how creativity works. It's just beating your head against the wall and trying a bunch of stuff that's wrong and backing into dark corners and crying yourself to sleep. And then, one day you try a thing that is less dumb than the stuff you've tried so far, right? But that's harder to make a movie about, or to have an origin story.
Yeah, interesting. On top of that, there's a relatively recent Steve Jobs movie, and they highlight this about his life, that he took a lot of credit, for example, for things that other people actually did, or that he needed a team for, things like that. But if the listener has not looked it up, or you guys haven't, I recommend there's an interview with Bill Burr with Conan O'Brien. You can find it on YouTube, and it's before this movie came out. And he's just like, I don't buy this Steve Jobs thing, man. Like, he just said, I want all of my music in this phone right now. Get on it, and it's like, and then he walks up on stage and he takes all the credit, but there's like a team of developers behind the whole thing. Yeah, things are often romanticized, and you can't not do it. I think it's part of how business works and how storytelling works, but it is pretty annoying when you're actually trying to do it.
I think the romantic thing about stuff like this, and why I like this idea, even though it's very different than interviewing.io, is at the root of it, you are removing inefficiency and you're fixing pain in a way that's like honest. You're looking at, you're like, here, if we just do this thing, it'll fix so much other stuff. And I find that that's so appealing. And maybe this isn't the right way to go about it, but I think most of the things I work on come from this place of trying to make things less bad and less dumb. And like, how do teenagers like think about, well, that's dumb, that's stupid, we shouldn't do it that way? Well, yeah, we shouldn't do dumb things. So how can we do fewer?
I think that's a great point to jump into action steps for someone who wanted to follow through on this idea. What would you do to get this going?
Yeah, well, I imagine that a fair amount of your listeners are probably skeptical about whether this is a good idea. You shouldn't take my word for it. I think that, like any business, the first thing you do before you actually get to work is to validate that somebody would pay money for it. Um, and I think the best way to do that is to just have a bunch of conversations with companies of a certain size, right? For very small startups, this is probably not that important, right? They're just stumbling. They just need to make hires. They don't care about their data. Just like, well, they're probably using a spreadsheet to track their applicants, and that's fine. That's how it should be. But then once you get to the point where you're doing a ton of interviews a week, and you do have an ATS, right? Maybe you're still a small business, but once you're big enough to pay Lever or Greenhouse double digit, like 5 figures a year, right? Then you're probably a good candidate for this. So just I would do a bunch of outreach to recruiters and recruiting operation managers, or potentially even eng managers, and just be like, hey, if I could just take your data and give you a bunch of reports, would that be valuable? Great. This is how much we charge for it. What do you think?
Do you think that there's space to actually even just offer that as a free service for folks? So you say, hey, give me all your data. I'll tell you which sources are most valuable. And you can use that data to inform the building of your solution, and they get that value immediately your answer.
I am very skeptical about giving. I mean, maybe for the first few, you do it for free because you don't know what the hell you're doing. Just so you don't feel bad that you're cheating people when you fail, if you fail, just for your own psychological well-being, right? But in general, when you give stuff away for free, you're not learning if people would pay for it, right? Because very few people are going to say no to free shit unless there's a time investment on their part to clean the data for you or do something, right? So
fair enough. Yeah. So you can still charge for that, but
charge something. It can be some, like, any price you come up with is going to be wrong.
Yeah.
So just pick a number and, change the number as needed. Pick something that's
let's pick a number. High. So let's say we have a company that has, and we could change this number if we want to. Let's say the company has 10 million annual revenue, and we want to ask for their data and say, give me your data. And I'm doing this new thing. It's hiring reports, and I'll tell you how to optimize your hiring based on the data you hand over. And the report is X amount of dollars. What's your first gut instinct? Talking about intuition, and it's going to be terrible because it's your intuition, but based on our earlier conversation, what's your gut instinct on a price that you would say would probably be reasonable to that $10 million
I guess my
first
business question might be, are we doing this as a one-time thing, or are we doing this actually as a subscription?
Let's talk about it as a one-time thing, because I think it's an easy way to we were just talking about that idea of getting started by just doing sort of like a one-off consult, and maybe that gets somebody interested.
Yep.
And it could be both. You could do a big lump sum start, and then for maintenance, you charge whatever per month.
Well, I mean, it's not even maintenance. It's just your data changes all the time, right? So you just have constant access to this. I mean, again, this is going to be wrong, but I also don't think it matters that much that it's wrong. You could even start somewhere pretty, think about what the budgets look like for the people you're dealing with. Let's say you approach an eng manager, right? Eng manager discretionary budget is typically in the hundreds of dollars. That's how much they can spend before they need to go up the chain and get approvals. So if that's who you're talking to, you may want to start there, right? Because that gives you that says this person would spend their discretionary budget on this. If you complicate it and now they have to go up the chain, that's probably harder because now there are other variables, right? And if it doesn't work out, is it because this person didn't want it, or is it because their boss didn't want it? Or is it because you never had the opportunity to turn this person into an advocate? Because maybe if you just let them use their discretionary budget on this, they get it. And now all of a sudden they're going to be your biggest fan, and it'll be much easier for them to take it up the chain. So I think it depends on who you're targeting. If you're targeting eng managers and saying, hey, you're spending this much eng time on hiring, we can help you make a few tweaks. We just need your data, and we need $200 to sort of.
Let's flip it to. I wanted to focus.
I'll give a quick tip. It's gonna be a quick thing. I recently did this and found it was pretty fascinatingly useful. Talking with someone who might have a budget for something and saying, finding out like, oh, what is your discretionary budget range? Not that I'm going to charge you exactly that, whatever, but tell me, oh yeah, I can spend up to $500, $1,000. Okay, great. Now we're talking about analytics of your data and it's about hiring. What would make it a no-brainer for you to spend, if they told me $1,000, what would make it a no-brainer for you to spend $800? And then, match that with what you can actually do and then propose it, right? So that you almost know you're going to get a yes before you propose it because you got an idea about what would make it a hell yes for them. That was my little tip there.
That's a great approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to turn the focus to the listener. Imagine that someone is out there, they like this idea, but they don't have the skill set to be able to manage data analytics in this way and even offer a consulting package to someone for $800 to do this. You did another rant that we saw on Twitter about how boot camps are overrated, culinary school is overrated. I imagine that would be similar for data analytics. How should someone learn a skill like this?
Good question. I'm trying to think how I learned it. So a lot of the stuff I write is pretty data heavy, but I am the first person to admit that I am a very bad data analyst and still have no idea what the hell I'm doing, but I sort of manage. Most of the data, I think the reason I'm saying this, I think anybody that has an appetite for this doesn't need much. I learned most of my stats in high school, and that is the level at which I operate as a high school not even AP statistics, just like a high school biology class where we had to do t-tests and chi-square tests. Like that's kind of
operating at a higher level than most journalists.
Yes, fair. That's fair. That's not nice, but it's probably true. So I think that, you could probably get started pretty quick if you just read a high school stats textbook. And also the good news is there are tools that you can use to sort of get comfortable with this stuff. One of my favorite tools that got me through my first few years of blogging, and now we have a data scientist on the team and it's such a relief. And, I feel dumb whenever I talk to him and that's good. That's probably how I should feel. But there's a tool that I love called StatWing. They got bought by Qualtrics a few years ago, but I think they still operate in their own right. And you can just give the tool a CSV, right? And just analyze so let's say you have a CSV with a bunch of columns and you want to see if column A and column B have some relationship to each other. You just say, tell me the relationship. Is there any statistical significance? And you can just, p-hack your way through it and figure out is there any significance here? And that's kind of, you throw spaghetti at the wall, but it also teaches you to develop some intuition for this stuff. And I think just messing around with that tool and reading a little bit of high school stats will get you 80% of the way. Maybe
I'm cynical, but that reminds me of, and this is a big leap, but it goes to the Great Recession and how, mortgage-backed securities got all bundled together because look at all these correlations and you see that they don't fail until they do fail and the entire system crumbles because they've all been attached and people didn't actually understand all the intricacies of how it's connected.
That is always a danger. That you're going to do it wrong.
Yeah,
that's true.
In the end, all the statistics is inductive reasoning, which really is, it's a problem. You can't make any certain conclusions with inductive reasoning.
Well, lies, damn lies, and statistics. The quote about statistics.
This is a bit of a flyer, and we're coming up on time here. But how do you think about this idea in terms of broader trends within the tech world and in the industry?
Well, that's a good question. Let's see. One of the things that's always flummoxed me a little bit is how far behind recruiting as an industry is behind sales, right? And marketing. And it is just sales and marketing, but because it's a cost center rather than a profit center, it doesn't get the same amount of attention. It doesn't get the same level of expert, the hiring is different. You're not going to typically bring on, Facebook has done this a bit to their credit, but you're not going to bring on full on data scientists and be you're just going to sit in the recruiting team. There's a subset called people operations or not people operations, people analytics, people analytics. And that's that, but it still feels like the ugly stepchild of analytics. And that's been just a source of confusion to me, even though I kind of get why it is. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in enabling cost centers like recruiting to have the same power as profit centers. You're going to work on smaller budgets. And like the thing that this is a very cynical thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. I kind of hate selling to cost centers. And if I were to do another business, I don't know if I'd do that again, because when you sell to a cost center, your main job is to sell products that make people look like they're doing a good job. Whereas when you sell to profit centers, you're actually selling them things that make them do a good job. It's a subtle distinction, but it sort of colors a lot. But I wish that cost centers could operate a little more like profit centers. And as recruiting becomes more and more of like a challenge for companies, perhaps we'll see some catch up. And I think that's where there's some opportunity.
Is there anything that you're doing in terms of tracking how hires are performing years after you've connected them with, and in terms of maybe you'd say that Interviewing IO actually turns into a profit center for your company because these engineers are 10x more valuable than someone else that you would hire?
So in some ways, what you describe is the holy grail of recruiting, because then you can actually do a little bit of longitudinal work and ultimately like unlock the secrets of human competence. So like, this is something I'm very excited about, but at the same time, I think that there's very little business case for it because recruiters are not incentivized to care about those things. They're very incentivized to get people in and get them hired. And if you try to operate long-term like that and invest time and effort into it, you'll be out of business before you have a chance to change anything.
That's exactly the point that you had made before. But is there a chance to get in front of the other side of the business and say, hey, this is actually going to be a long-term profit thing for you? And maybe in organizations that change CFOs, change leadership every 4 years, it doesn't make sense. But the companies that have the same CEO since 1995 or something like that, they may be more incentivized to think longer term.
I would like that to be true. And we have been tracking some of this data. I think it's going to be a while. Like they're relative to, I mean, we have like 5,000 people signing up every month, but how many of those turn into hires? A lot less, right? So it's going to be a while before we probably have enough data and enough time has passed to say something definitive. Certainly that's a valuable argument, but I think that the argument that's probably going to sell even better is, look, if people just interview better, you're going to save this much time in your funnel and this many dollars. And that goes back to why I think this idea is important. But I want to do what you describe.
I just want to point this out for the listener. It's a very interesting thing that I've noticed from the very beginning of this episode that, we often think that a business owner is about generating, dollars of income, right? And that is a very important ingredient that if you don't have it, you don't have a business. But really, the longer I'm working as an entrepreneur, the more I learn, I'm a facilitator between a lot of different parties, and I'm providing value to the employees just as much as I'm providing value to the customers, and it's, even though the businesses in general might not think in these terms, and it's harder to actually sell things and do the math for them, cost savings as opposed to spending or sort of income, it doesn't make it less true and powerful if you understand it as a business owner. Just want to make that point.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Aileen. This has been a wonderful conversation. Great idea that you shared. It's a lot for someone to dig into here if they are looking to start a business, which is, go do this, listener. Tell us what you've done. Even if it's not directly the actions that we've talked about here, we want to hear about them. We want to know what your takeaways are. We'll feed them back to Aileen and see if she turns your comments into a rant, maybe on a Twitter feed or blog.
I'll even throw this out. If somebody wants to build this and it's in a state where it's easy to use it on multiple companies without like too much setup, this is something that Interviewing IO would pay for. I'm not sure how much. I haven't thought it through, but if this could be part of our sales process, right, where instead of having to blunder around and ask, what does your funnel look like? If we could just say, hey, you're just going to get this as part of talking to us. that's not trivial, right? And our deal sizes, can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I will throw that out there as like, we could also be your customer, and I'm very motivated for someone to do this. But of course, we can't build it ourselves in-house because we have too much other, like, just like the ATS.
There's a big carrot right there for everyone listening.
Yeah.
So Aileen, tell us a little bit more about where listeners can go to follow you and learn more about Interviewing IO.
Well, if you're a software engineer and you're starting to think about interviews and you're worried because interviews suck, go to Interviewing IO and sign up. We're really, really good at mock interviews and feedback, and they're anonymous, so you can screw up all you want and nobody will know. If you're an employer, we're really good at hiring people because we know how they do in interviews, and it's an arbitrage opportunity basically for you if you work with us. And to find out more about me, I guess you can follow me on Twitter. I rant about things like boot camps and culinary school from time to time, and God knows what else. I have a dumb Twitter handle, but it's Aileen Lerner LLC.
Nice. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Aileen. Pleasure spending this time with you on a Friday afternoon. And
right back at you guys.
I know it's tough to rein you in here because you're just starting off so strong with cussing like a sailor, like we said at the top of the hour. But yeah, you pulled it together for us. So kudos to you for that.
Thank you. I do what I can.
All right, to the listener, we'll see you next week, and let us know what you think about this episode. Leave us a review on your iTunes system, Apple Podcast, whatever it's called right now. And we'll talk to you later.
All right, I'll log us off online.
Cool. I stopped the Zencastr recording, so we're going to wait for that to